This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew. This episode is brought to you by the American Homebrewers Association, a community of more than 45,000 beer and brewing enthusiasts worldwide. The AHA publishes Zymurgy magazine, hosts the National Homebrew Competition and HomebrewCon, and equips members with brewing tips, proven recipes, and money-saving deals on beer, food, and brewing supplies. Founded in 1978, the AHA remains true to founder Charlie Papazian's timeless advice: relax, don't worry, have a homebrew. Celebrate beer and homebrewing with the AHA at homebrewersassociation.org.
Hi everybody, it's John Hall and I'm in Westchester County this week at the Captain Lawrence Brewing Company. We have brewer and founder Scott Vaccaro here, who has not only led the charge for good beer in this area, but has also served as a mentor and as a sort of a father figure, I think, to a lot of brewers in this area. Not necessarily because of your age, but just because of when you started. And for those of you who aren't familiar with New York's geography, Westchester County is north of New York City. It has a lot of really nice suburbs to it, a lot of really nice towns. It has some leafy enclaves, as they were.
A lot of foliage.
And it's not necessarily a place where craft beer or beer in general had been on anybody's radar, and it wasn't. This was always sort of a wine county, as it were, a high-end spirits county. And then Scott, you came along and sort of changed all of that, and we're here at what is your newer brewery.
Yep.
Which you now have an outdoor beer garden. You have a huge 40-barrel brew house and production facility here, and it's going to continue to grow. When you started off as a home brewer in your kitchen, and I know this is sort of a throwaway question, but did you ever think that it would be this big? Was it ever part of the plan?
No. I mean, how could you dream something up like this at that age? I mean, I was 17 when I started, so it was 5 gallons on the stove seemed like a lot of beer at one point in time. I eventually graduated up to 15 gallons and then 25-gallon batches that I made it into college, but to think of a 40-barrel brew house and 25,000 barrels of beer a year, no, I most certainly did not expect it. But I always knew I just wanted to make beer and have fun with it.
So I mentioned this area didn't have much by the way of craft beer when you came into the scene, and New York and this general area has always been kind of a tough nut to crack, be it space, be it real estate, be it just sort of the sheer amount of people. It can actually be harder to gain traction for smaller niche products than one might think. Why Westchester, I guess, first of all, and then how did you go about convincing people to show up at your door, first at the old brewery and now here? What were those early years like as far as public awareness, and what was the key to it?
Well, yeah, I mean, Westchester was the obvious answer for me because this is where I was born and raised. The brewery Captain Lawrence Brewing takes its name from Captain Lawrence Drive, right here in Westchester, where I grew up. It was more of a there was no real question of it in my mind. This is where I grew up. This is where I knew people. This is where my family was. This is where I wanted to make beer. So I didn't really think too much about whether or not it was going to be hard, whether or not there was going to be a lot of acceptance of it, whether or not it was the right demographics, etc. It just seemed like this is where I live. This is where I want to make beer. It's true what you said. Westchester was very, there's a great culinary scene here. A lot of wine, a lot of high-end spirits, a lot of high-end restaurants, and a lot of people that commute into New York City that know the best of the best and expect. And so we just took it as a hand sell approach. I mean, when we opened up here and we brewed our first batch in December of 2005, and it started working on the facilities that August, we immediately went out. We went door to door. We knew we had a list of accounts by town. And we just categorized, we just sliced and diced the county and walked in, and we just got a real feel for who was going to be into local beer, who knew what craft beer was, who had any interest in learning more about craft beer, and who was going to place that order the day we showed up with an actual keg. And so we went into it feeling pretty confident that we were gonna do a pretty good job in getting it out there quickly. However, when push came to shove and when people had to open up the checkbook and actually buy a keg from us, it became a little bit more difficult. And I still remember very, very vividly going into that first account and giving them my pitch and, bringing in unlabeled bottles of beer that I had filled off the Bright Beer tank that were probably semi-carbonated. They probably weren't, all the way where they needed to be. And, I poured them out and he looked at me and he said, these are really nice. I wish you the best of luck, but it's not for us. And I was like, I left that meeting and I was like, oh God, this is going to be a little more difficult than I thought.
Yeah.
Now, in retrospect, that account is now one of our biggest accounts in the county. And
they found the error of their ways.
Yeah, they came around. But there was a lot of that in the beginning. But there were also a lot of yeses. And so once the yeses began, they kind of just snowballed. At that point in time, too, New York maybe had 40 breweries in the whole state.
Yeah.
Maybe the U.S. had 1,500 total breweries in the whole country. So bringing something new and local, it was, for the people who got it, they got it. And that's kind of how we started. And, we did, in the early days, I did all the brewing, packaging, and delivering, by myself. And I had one other person who was helping out with sales, just kind of hitting the road in between.
Is it more difficult to get into accounts now? Just more people know about craft beer and good beer. Are you finding it, and now there's more breweries and there's
Sure.
still the same amount of tap handles. Are you finding it more difficult for a brewery your size to continue to get the business that you relied on for such a long time?
I think that in today's day and age, it's maybe not as hard to get into an account, but it is hard as hell to stay in the account.
Okay.
And so, going in and saying, yeah, I got this, and, people, most publicans now these days, they don't care about buying a sixtel, paying a little bit more for it because they know it's going to be going in 2 days.
Yeah.
And they got the next one in there. And, selling a half barrel and getting a permanent line and getting a month or 2 months or 3 months out of an account is difficult. I will say that when you do get into those accounts that tend to keep the beer on for a considerable amount of time, that's where you truly build your brand, and that's where your best accounts end up being. So I don't think the craft beer industry would be where it is today without these rotator bars and without people taking anything and anything and putting it on tap. They've really opened up a lot of people's eyes, but those are the most difficult accounts for a brewery our size, at least, to gain traction in and continue to grow the brand. I think probably the smaller, newer guys, those are probably the accounts where they sell most of their beer at, because those accounts want to keep up with what's hot, what's new, and it's the circle of life, so to speak, in the beer world these days. It's you're new, you're hot, you're middle aged, you're old, and then maybe you're old and hot again. I don't know.
Well, when you say a brewery your size, what did you guys close out 2017 with?
We did just shy of 25,000 barrels.
Okay.
So
a solid regional player.
Yeah, most of that volume too is sourced in the New York Metro. Mm-hmm. Westchester County, New York's Brooklyn, Manhattan, Northern Jersey, Southern Connecticut. Those are our bread and butter. Westchester County is still a monster for us in the Lower Hudson Valley.
One of the things that you touched on that I think we're starting to see more of these days are brewers that are in the middle. As it were. So small guys who are doing 1,500 barrels a year, all of it out of their tap room. Mm-hmm. Sky's the limit for them right now, and it's sort of right before the stock market crashed. Nothing can go wrong. These are heady days. And the larger guys, we're obviously seeing their volume drop off as well. Mm-hmm. And 25,000 barrels is nothing to sneeze at, but it's also one of those ones where what's your biggest concern right now because of your size?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a valid question.
For those of you playing along at home, that's when you take a drink. When somebody says that's a great question, that's the game we're playing now.
I could use a drink for that question. We've built up a business, and anyone this size, you have a lot of infrastructure, you have a lot of overhead, and so, if I could convert all 25,000 barrels of that to right out my door, I'd be the happiest man on earth. But that's just not the case. We maybe did over 1,000 barrels out of our door, which isn't that bad. But if we could get up to 5,000, then I'd sleep a lot better at night. It really just comes down to distributors. As much as they say they're not brand collectors, and I don't think they are. Most of them, most of them will take on anybody and everybody because they want to see what's next and what's hot, and nobody knows unless you try to sell it. And so, my biggest concern is that as more breweries pop up and The distributors continue to take on more and more brands. It gets harder for a brewery like mine to stand out outside of their home market. Now, whether that means we retrench and we stay closer to home and we don't spread out as much as we might have planned on doing 5 years ago, it's just smart planning. But it's really just a matter of what keeps me up at night is just maintaining the focus of the sales force that we've built up and the distribution networks we built up. Because as that contracts, if you can't replace it with home sales at home, you end up it gets harder to pay the bills.
And you've had expansions and contractions. I live in Jersey, just the next
Sure.
state over. You guys were in Jersey for a while, and then I went into the store one day, and then you guys were gone. I was like, whoa, what happened? And then now you guys are back, which is great.
Yeah, we pulled out of southern Jersey, actually.
Yeah.
We're only in northern Jersey now. So, yeah, I mean, there is a lot of ebbs and flows. There definitely are, and I never would have, we started selling beer in the D.C. Metro last year, Maryland, Virginia, D.C., and never would have thought in a million years we'd sell as much beer as we did. And, it's looking like a good year this year, too, even though it's just started. So you kind of pick and choose where you think your brand is going to resonate, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And if it doesn't, there's no shame in pulling back.
Sure. You mentioned that if you could sell all of your beer out of your tap room, you'd be a happy guy, or at least getting up to 5,000 barrels. At the older brewery, it was more difficult to get as many people in. You now have a space where you can fit a good amount of people if the weather's nice and even if the weather's not. Is that we keep hearing tap rooms of the future? We keep hearing. This is what brewers need to be focusing on is selling out their own door. When did you have that realization that, hey, we need
the first week we opened up?
Okay.
I mean, the first weekend we were open in Pleasantville with a little 250 square foot
brewery,
little 250 square foot tasting room. That first day we had 300 people show up, for growlers. I never thought. I took the time to write a business plan. I made projections. They were all thrown out the window in a week, but I didn't even bother to put the tasting room in the equation. At that point in time, tasting rooms were, they were cool. I expected people to come in and try beer. I didn't expect people to come in and buy 12 growlers at a time or buy kegs or, and then start making sour ales. You get 300 people lined up wanting to buy, $15 bottles of sour. And, it really did open my eyes. There's obviously drawbacks depending on your setup. And, if you're not set up for it properly, it can definitely, there can be some unhappy customers, unhappy neighbors, unhappy landlords, etc. And so,
you experienced all of
that.
Yeah,
I experienced all those things. We're in a position now where we, when we first took over this building that we're in now, we had basically a 1,200 square foot tasting room and a bunch of grass outside. We quickly realized that the grass would be much better converted into a bocce court and a small little outdoor beer garden.
Yeah.
And so we added a small little outdoor beer garden and a bocce court. Then we realized that the outdoor beer garden we added was not big enough. So we did another expansion. And then we decided that wasn't big enough, and then I had to go before the town board and get a wetlands variance, and because there's a little drainage ditch that was, keeping me from utilizing all the grass. And
sure, of course.
We went and got that variance, and now we have
have
close to 6,000 square feet of outdoor space.
Okay.
And it really wasn't open until last April, and so last year was our first real season with it. And by the end of the season, it was jamming. So we're expecting a pretty fun year this year out there.
On a previous episode of this podcast, I sat down with Jeff O'Neill, Chief of Industrial Arts in the Hudson Valley, a great New York brewer. And he, in his business plan, was saying that he overplanned for success. And that there's so many people who are opening up these days who are under-planning for success. They're being very modest in their gains or in their hopes. And that in this day and age, you almost have to have the expectation that if your beer is good and you have a good place, that people are going to be coming to you and wanting to buy more. Taproom space aside, is there anything that surprised you now that you look back from that initial business plan that you said, man, I really missed the mark on that? Like, I wish I had done X this much sooner.
Well, my original business plan actually had me self-distributing throughout the entire New York Metro, into New York City, into Brooklyn, into Long Island.
Oh, sure.
X amount of trucks I'd need to do this, that. In hindsight, I wish I could have pulled that off. But, knowing what I've been through in the past 12 years, I know that wouldn't have been possible. I mean, at this point in time, we have close to 1,000 draft lines out there just in the New York Metro. And, we're on Stop and Shop, ShopRite. We're in all the chains, packing those out on the week. I mean, it never could have happened. But, again, we kind of grew up in a time where it was kind of a race to gain distribution and spread out. And I always did that slow and steady. I never really wanted to, we were getting calls from all over the country, do you want to say, in the earlier days. And, I always held back. And then it got to the point where I think that model flipped maybe 3 or 4 years ago, and people are no longer really, there's definitely people out there still shooting for it, but a lot of people now have realized that you make a lot more margin selling it out your tap room. And if you can create the scarcity model or make enough beer to only, to satisfy your locals or the, people that are willing to drive to you and get in line, then you're going to make a lot more money and you're going to have a lot less headaches because you're not going to have to deal with distribution. And at the end of the day, dealing with distributors, while they're all our partners and our friends, and I love them all dearly. I mean, they each have their own agenda, their own set of issues to deal with, their own brands they want to push. And so, I don't think I'm the only one that would recommend this, but if I was to open up a brewery today, I would open up with a spacious tap room, a great outdoor space to sit, a small kitchen that you're able to at least have guest chefs come in and use, and produce beer for on-site consumption.
So we walked through the brew house, excuse me, before we started. You guys are canning off IPA today, and you, like so many other breweries, have two programs, essentially, clean and wild, as it were. Started off clean, started off with just the traditional brewery recipes,
sure.
IPA and et cetera. Were sours always something that interested you? Or yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I came of age, I started homebrewing at 17 and immediately found every book I could on it. And the books that spoke to me were Michael Jackson's, Great Beers of Belgium.
Yeah.
And you read those books and the way he writes about, Cantillon and Bone and, the Dole Brewers and, Rodenbach, you read Leafman's, you read these stories and see these pictures and, they were just these, the words just, I could taste it without tasting it. And the more I read them and I'd read them over and over again, just trying to, say, maybe I missed something. And, eventually when I found some of those beers, it just blew me away. And, most of the beers that really spoke to me within his writing were the lambics and the sours, because I just always had this fascination with oak and barrels, and it's just a romantic vessel, I guess. And so from day one, I was home trying to make homebrewed sours when I was still in college, using little 5-gallon oak barrels, 10-gallon oak barrels, and then that first batch of sour beer we made, the Cuvée de Castleton. I mean, that was put in a barrel within 2 months of us opening in 2006, or Bruner.
When you did that in 2006, I mean, the whole notion of what this style and this category would become was still so infantile at this point, and it's blown up to what it is today. Was this just going to be like a fun pet project, and you knew maybe there'd be some other folks who had read Jackson who have come through, or that you maybe get
I had
like a secret handshake kind of club.
I mean, I kind of, I had my brewing heroes, it was Vinny and Peter Bouquet and, Dan Carey. And I traveled across the country. We went to school in California, but I lived in New York, and I'd stop at New Glarus, I'd stop at New Belgium, I'd go to Russian River, and I'd buy some of these beers that, the Americanized versions of those, and those would, again, blow my mind. And, I still have bottles of La Folie cork cage 750s hand numbered in my basement that I probably picked up in 2000 or 99, or I couldn't even tell you when. But
what's your address in the alarm?
Yeah, so I think I have 3 of those left. But yeah, I mean, those were beers that really just spoke to me, and the process. I mean, no beer is easy. Beer is not easy to make if you want to make it really well and make it consistent. But those beers are just next level, and to make to really put your trust that you're creating a substrate in wort and putting it in a barrel, and then just closing your eyes and saying, in a year and a half or 6 months, or this is going to taste the way I want it to taste, and it's going to be delicious. I mean, there's a lot of faith you're putting in yourself and in your process, and so that is why those sour beers were always just such a fascination to me, and continue to be to today.
And you've now put your own twist on some of them. You've branched out a little bit more. I mean, what is your approach when you're making a sour beer these days? Something that's been aging in a barrel. Like what do you look for when you're creating or trying to create something new, or looking for inspiration? Like, where do you go?
Well, I mean, within our own brewery and our own cellar of barrels and whatnot, I mean, it's always based, for me, over the years, the one lesson I've learned, or at least my palate has evolved to understand, is that, restrained acidity can really open up the flavor of the beer. I've had way too many beers that are just so sour that you can't taste anything other than the sour. And we've really tried hard to create beers that are have a titratable acidity that is a reasonable level that allows you to actually taste what's in the beer, not just pucker up. And then the base beer, if it's going to be fruited, we've tried to create a few different variants on a base that we think will complement the fruits that we use, whether it be a golden ale, a brown ale, a red ale, a black ale. And that's kind of the approach that we take. But sour for just being sour, I think, is a horrible idea. And dirty sour versus clean sour is also something I'm not a big fan of.
Expand on that. What do you see as dirty versus clean when it comes to that?
Well, I think the flavors that you get from an unsuccessful spontaneous fermentation or an enteric fermentation when it first starts off, and you get some of those, the bugs that nobody really wants to actually consume because they probably make you sick. As they work through the beginning, they do create a lot of these really, to me, phenolic, plastic, and unpleasant flavors. Okay. And that, I feel like that I've had some successful and unsuccessful samplings of beers made in that fashion. That again, just the romance behind the production needs to equal the flavors that they put out. You can't just say, "Hey, I did this awesome, spontaneously fermented ale that aged in oak for 3 years and and it's gorgeous. I hand corked it, and then you open it and it tastes like shit." So the process has to lead to an end product, and I don't know that everyone understands that.
No. And I don't think that they do. And I think we're at this point now with so many breweries and so many people trying their hand at it, and they're not taking the time or putting the thought in, because pretty much anything that brewers make these days, they're guaranteed to sell to somebody. So they're not stopping to necessarily say oh, is this really our best representation? And so as somebody who learned from Vinny and Peter and Dan and you have inspired brewers as well to go off and do their own thing and to try their hand at something. What's the frustration level like when brewers, fellow people in your profession, are taking a style that you're passionate about, that you've had for a long time, and are, as you said, just putting shit out there?
I mean, I think, well, it's frustrating. I mean, it's, I try to be very, I get handed beers a lot at festivals and, at events, and I'm asked what I think, and I always try to be very constructive in my criticism. But, I think that...
But you do give criticism.
I try. I try to do it in a very soft and gentle way. But, I think people, I think the people that are trying to make these beers, I think that they would be... that they'd be well served to drink their beers that they've created and that they're proud of, and they should be proud that they've tried and that they've put in the hard work. They should try them up against some of the ones that are the standard bearers of what they should taste like. Right. And when you do that, and I've done that time and time again over the years, and many times been very disappointed in what my beer tasted like after doing that, and dumped it down the drain or whatnot. You really start to learn, and this is what. You take out consecration or supplication and you taste that against your dark fruited ale, and then you tell me what your dark fruited ale tastes like, and does it taste right? And then there's obviously just the clear flaws. There's the acetyl, nail polish remover and diacetyl, and if you don't have a nose that can detect those, find somebody who can and let them sniff your beers for you, because you get all those flavors in those beers and they should be going down the drain. Yeah. We did. We had one of our experimental brews here that one of our brewers put together was a kvass, and it was he used Russian rye bread and loaves and did a sour mash and an overnight fermentation. I mean, that beer went down the drain so fast that he couldn't even fucking it just it was an awesome idea. Sure. And there was a lot of time and energy and well intent spent on creating it, and they had nothing but the best intentions, and there was nothing wrong with the execution, but the flavors. Microorganisms sometimes can do some funny things, and it just, to me, it smelled in a way that I couldn't bring myself to serve a customer that beer, and so we put it down the drain.
And I wonder if how much that has to do with when you opened, in that you didn't have the room for error back then, because if you put out something that had a clear flaw or tasted bad in those very, very early days, you'd be eclipsed pretty fast, because it'd be like, all right, well, we tried the local guy, but now we're going back to our handle of bud.
Yeah, I mean, that is a good point, but I would argue it's even worse today. I mean, if you make bad beer today, you're done in a second. Like, I feel like people may have been a little more forgiving and maybe gave you a couple chances, where now probably if somebody tastes a beer they don't like, they just write it off and they say, there's 5,000 other breweries I can get a beer from. So it's,
I think sours, yes, maybe for IPAs and porters and some of the
from a sour standpoint.
From a sour standpoint, though, I think it's still Wild West.
Oh yeah, without a doubt.
Okay,
without a doubt.
One of the things with your sour program, we talked about this, and by the way, if you're listening to this podcast, you should go back into our archives of Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. You can see a profile I wrote on Scott that appeared in an issue towards the end of 2017. It's also online at our website, beerandbrewing.com. But in that article and in the course of those interviews, we talked about your barrel program, and I want to switch gears to that because it does apply to your sour program. But everybody has a barrel program these days.
Sure.
Everybody who starts has a barrel program, and it's usually, depending on your size, 2 or 3 barrels that's sitting off in a corner somewhere of different origin, of various age, of basically whatever you could get your hands on. And I think that that's a smart way to start off, and you get to experiment a little bit. But you started off that way, but then you graduated into a well thought out process.
We've tried.
You're being honest. It's a well thought out process. I mean, walk us through how you changed your barrel program to what it is today.
Sure. Yeah. Being where we are, and again, just as the craft beer industry has grown up, have the suppliers that supply the craft beer industry. So, when we opened up, I couldn't get barrels really. I mean, at the time, bourbon barrels were tough to come by. Wine barrels were 3,000 miles away for the most part. And anything other than that, you could pretty much forget about. So, I mean, I did a lot of Googling and whatnot. We got wine barrels from the winery that actually happened to be next door to us, which is more of an equipment supplier, but they made some wine. So we had that source. But I just started looking online and doing my best to research. I mean, and I ended up uncovering, Virgin Island rum barrels that I just contacted a distillery in Florida that happened to bring them over. I found a distillery down in New Jersey, an oldest in America, that made apple brandy, and I called them up. Laird's Applejack.
Yeah.
They've been a great partner, and we've been purchasing barrels from them for years. A couple bronze medals at the GABF for Golden Delicious using their barrels. I contacted somebody in Portugal and got port barrels shipped over, and I found somebody selling an 800-gallon foeder in Napa that was used as a garden ornament that I bought, and my mom climbed in and cleaned out. So back then it was kind of like, get what you get. And
did she offer, or did you ask?
I begged. I was even at that point I was too big to fit in that hole to get in there. So she squeezed in there. There's a picture of it somewhere. The barrel's actually sitting right out there. It's out front.
Oh, is that when you're driving in?
Yeah, that was the original. That was our original foeder that I purchased in 2007, maybe. Way before fooders were widely available.
Yeah.
And so in the beginning, it was get what scrounge up what you can find. Try to come up with a cohesive plan for the beer that was going to go in it, and then when you had time to deal with it. And if you had a specific plan, roll with it. And that was it was very much a lot of experimentation. A lot of it worked, a ton of it did not work, and a lot of it went down the drain. As I began to get more reliable sources for barrels and start to understand where I could get these things from, then we started creating more batched out sours, meaning that we had a plan. We knew we needed 20 oak barrels, we were going to do this size batch of this style of beer, and it was going to get these Brettanomyces and this kind of grapes, and it was going to go for X amount of months, and that kind of worked out well. As we wanted to start playing with different fruit and different finishings, we found that using 55-gallon barrels became increasingly difficult from just a labor standpoint and from a practicality standpoint. Trying to jam 100 pounds of crushed up grapes and grape juice into a 55-gallon barrel that already has beer in it can be fairly problematic and cause a lot of things to be checking out on a regular basis. And so as the program evolved towards these set styles and more of a defined process of brew a clean beer, filter that clean beer, pitch wild yeast and specific bacteria, age in oak, add fruit at a specified time and titratable acidity and gravity, age until secondary fermentation complete, until flavors come together, then rack, bottle condition, and keg. So it went from, now we have a defined process in defined size barrels and vessels, when it was just once, let's see what we can put in some barrels and see what happens.
And how is that? I mean, it sounds like that's been to the great benefit, but
Yeah, I think so, from a consistency standpoint, from a flavor development standpoint, and from an efficiency of equipment standpoint, meaning that, like, we have one gigantic 1,800-gallon barrel that we need to treat and take care of and make sure it's happy and make sure it's topped off, rather than 40 little barrels, or 80 little barrels. So I think it's worked out well for us. We found a lot more consistency, but if a tank doesn't work, it's, it used to be 40 different barrels and maybe 5 of them didn't taste right. Now it's all or nothing.
Yeah.
And so we have had ones that we unfortunately didn't work.
What are those days like?
It's, to be honest with you, some of them weren't quite sour enough, no matter what we threw at them, and some, unfortunately, you get a little bit of that enteric and then acetaldehyde, and you just get the flavors that, I think a lot of, maybe more not as many now, but I think there was a point in time where a lot of brewers thought that you could blend good and bad beer together and get good beer. You can't blend out nail polish remover, no matter how hard you try, at least in my estimation.
And there's a certain point, though, where you just know that you have to give up.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Well, a lot of people don't want to reach that point, though,
sure,
or admit it.
Right. But, I mean, what is it for you? Is it nail polish? Is there?
Yes.
Okay. So there's...
You get acetaldehyde, yeah. You get ethyl acetate, and you get diacetyl. Diacetyl can go away. Ethyl acetate's never going away, at least on a higher level.
Right.
And you get vinegar, ethyl acetate, and to me, that is just not the right... Those are not the right flavors in sour beer, but that's just that's my flavor, I mean, there's probably plenty of successful American sour brewers out there that are selling beers that have a titratable acidity of 18, and if I drank them, I would feel like I had battery acid going down my throat. But they're happy with them, and their customers like them. And
sure,
it's a very to me, it's again, I'm not making sour beer to make beer sour. I'm making sour beer to add complexity and flavors, and they all have to work together, not just be sour.
What are some of the ingredients that have inspired you, that you've done rose hips, you've done a variety of different things in the experimental phase? Are there...
I mean, grapes have always been a huge influencer. I mean, not only from a color contribution, but from a acidity, acidity contribution. Or, they had tartness, they had, beautiful flavors. I mean, the sour beer and wine, they're very close, and in a lot of their characteristics, and so I think they blend beautifully together, personally. But I also think that with fruit, and I'd say 99.9% of the fruit that we use is from New York State. So we use local fruit because it just makes sense. Now, we are going to do something with dragon fruit this year, and dragon fruit does not grow in New York State, so that'll be... But all the other fruits, apricots, peaches, strawberries, raspberries, blackberries, cherries, plums, grapes even. We got 2,000 pounds of Cabernet grapes from Thirsty Owl up in the Finger Lakes this year. Gorgeous stuff. So, yeah, I mean, fruit. I lost my train of thought.
Well, no, but... The hybrid, or the act of adding grapes to beer,
yeah,
I think is increasingly interesting to people, especially because we're seeing a lot more cross drinkers these days. We're seeing
sure,
people who used to be like, well, I'm a beer person, or I'm a wine person, or I'm a spirits person. Now we're seeing all three as well.
Oh,
I
feel like that female wine drinkers, especially if they drink white wines, like our Barrel Select Gold or some of the Cuvée. I mean, they'll love it. It's just got a lot of that similar characteristic. It's bright, it's sparkly, it's it's tart. It's not tear your throat out acidic, and it's they're refreshing.
And it does open up new avenues for sales as well, where you can say, oh, if you're a wine drinker,
sure,
you're going to like this as well. You brought up something really interesting, though, of color. of SRM, and it's something that when it comes to sours, I'm not always sure people are thinking of, because we're so focused on the flavor, but we do drink visually so much. What do you look for when you're picking out ingredients? Are you hoping that, are you looking at ingredients for color?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important, like, for the point you just made. I mean, so we made a batch of Hudson Valley Harvest Cherry. It's a golden ale with cherries from right up the road. And we did 4 different cherries. We did Montmorency, Surefire, Balaton, and Danube. And I believe it was the Surefire has a white flesh, white insides. And we made this beer with it, and it had no color.
Yeah.
And people are like, well, how is this a cherry beer? It's not red. And I'm like, yeah, but taste it and smell it, and it is. Whereas the Danube and the Montmorency's were like these beautiful pink red hues, and immediately people say, it makes sense. So we have given thought to that. Would I use Surefire again? Probably not, to be honest with you. I mean, it made a nice beer, but I'd rather use something I didn't have to explain that, yes, it does actually have cherry in it.
And explain over and over and over and over again. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's for the obvious ones, like, the black raspberry that we do. I mean, it's purple, and but beers that use like peaches and whatnot, you don't really get a lot of flavor contribution. But yeah, I mean, I think it tells us, it helps tell the beer's story for sure. The dragon fruit one we're going to be making, it's going to be pink.
Yeah.
And you want it to be pink.
Right. You'd hope so. Yeah. If it wasn't.
If it's not pink, I'm going to be in trouble.
Yeah. I want to ask you, before we started recording, we were talking about sort of the nature of independence these days, and how it's more important now than ever. And in the face of so many breweries that have been sold to larger companies these days, and independence, I think, is super important. But especially if you are a regional player. Like here, I'm looking around the walls, and I'm seeing all of these various partnerships that you've had, local civic awards that you guys have been honored with. There's firefighter patches from different station houses on the walls. This feels very local, and we talk about craft, and that's been a changing term. We do talk about independence, but is the nature of independence? How does that play into where you are? Physically, as opposed to this larger idea of, we're independent, so we're not one of these big guys. Like, how does location factor into independence in your mind?
Oh, wow. Well, I mean, the whole thing with independence, at least the way I look at it is that if you are an independent brewer, no matter where your location, really, you have the same struggles. Whether you be highly successful or you be, small and just starting out, you still have the same realities of the day, in which is that you actually do have to pay your bills, and you actually do have to worry about the bottom line, and you do have to pay your employees, and you have to deal with those problems. When you start getting gobbled up by the larger and larger players, those realities go away. I have nothing against the people that have sold out, good for them, but they've created, to steal a term from a well-known brewer out there, they become weapons of mass destruction, and then can be used in ways that the economics of being a normal brewery can no longer be. And so, it's like any industry, and it just tips the playing field. And, to the point about, local partnerships and, where we are, I mean, the only way we survive as a business, this size, smaller, larger, is to be a part of your community and not just be an island within a state or a space. I mean, we need to be a living, breathing community, basically, in order to survive. And the only way we do that is to be a part of the community, invite them into our space, and to have them understand what it is we go through, and how we try to help and be a part of what they're going through.
We're at a point where I think early on, when you first started, and when so many other folks first started, they weren't thinking about the next stage. They weren't thinking about the next generation. They weren't thinking about, what does the brewery do after I'm gone, as it were, especially founders. And we had Larry Bell on the show a couple weeks ago, and he was talking about how he passed the brewery on to his daughter, and they had this whole rigmarole to make that happen. Not everybody has that. Some folks are going ESOP, and then other people are just selling to other people. How much thought do you give to what happens to Captain Lawrence when you're ready to retire?
I have not given it much thought as of late. I mean, I'm 39. I got some time to go. I always, I tell my wife they're going to have to pry me out of here when it's time for me to go home at the end of it all. But, I haven't given it a ton of thought. I mean, I think, face value, it would be amazing if my kids wanted to run the place. I don't know that I'd want them to have to deal with it. I mean, it's, again, don't get me wrong, it's an awesome business to be in. I love it. I wouldn't do anything else. I don't know how to do anything else. But there are a lot of headwinds out there. And there's, it really is a business that if you're not creative and you're not constantly coming up with new things, you're done. Like this is evolve or die. I mean, that's where we're at today. You could look at a lot of legacy brewers out there today that have tried to evolve, and maybe the scale they were at with some of those legacy brands wouldn't allow any small innovations to make a difference. I feel fortunate that we're at a place where, 5 years ago our pale ale was our biggest seller. It sure as hell isn't anymore.
What is it now?
It's our IPA, and it's some of these smaller batch, new IPAs, if you will, New England style, Northeast style, hazy IPAs have been growing like crazy, even for someone our size, So, I don't know that I'd want them to get into this industry unless they were creative enough to, to realize that they got to keep it going.
Where do you look for inspiration for when you're going forward? You're saying it's adapt or die, and it is. And I think that there's so many folks who have put so much of their eggs in the hazy IPA basket right now, and it's a fine style and it's certainly doing really well. But we know that this is a fickle industry, and something else is going to eclipse it at some point. How do you stay nimble in something like this?
I mean, you have to look internally to people that you have, and hopefully you've built a good team. And I know I got a lot of very creative people that work here, and that little pilot system we walked back before, I think we did close to 90 brews on that last year. Wow. And we've done some cool stuff. And you definitely look out and you see trends and what other people are doing. And I've always drawn inspiration from reading about other beers before even tasting them, and that's always been the thing that's always gotten my mind turning. Like wow, they use this and they did this, and they're saying it tastes like this, but what if they did this and they did that? And it kind of gets the creative juices flowing. And then culinarily, I mean, you look at what's out there and what you like for food. We just totally changed over our menu here in the tasting room to a Southeast Asian inspired menu. That is, a lot of people are telling me is crazy, and it's got nothing. It doesn't, it's not a beer hall menu. And I'm like, what? But we're making a lot of crazy beers too that have a lot of different flavors, and I think these flavors are going to work well together. So, I'm sure that food is now going to inspire a whole new wave of beers that we're going to be making based on some of those ingredients.
And there's something to be said about not having beer hall style, like, everybody's got burgers, everybody's got, et cetera, to stand out a little bit more. I mean, that's of interest to me.
That is the argument that I've been having internally with our staff since I finally pulled the trigger and made the decision. I think it took a little while for everyone to really get over it, but, I think that it was the right move to make. Like I said, nobody is ever going to go Instagram a picture of our cheeseburger. But they may like, maybe the bao buns or the dan noodles or the, whatever, they're going to, the flavors are the flavors. Like, if you like flavor, it doesn't matter if it's Southeast Asian or if it's New American or it's French, it's flavor.
I think that's a good place to leave it.
Sounds good to me.
Scott Vaccaro of Captain Lawrence Brewing, thanks for having us here in your tasting room. We're here on a day when your guys are actually brewing in the back and it's not open to the public, so that's the background noise that folks heard. You should definitely come and check out the brewery and the 6,000 square feet of space outside next time you're in the greater Westchester County area. People can find you online at CaptainLawrenceBrewing.com. Perfect, and you can find us online at beerandbrewing.com. If you have questions for me, guests you'd like to see on this podcast or hear on this podcast, I should say, or just general comments, you can reach me at John Holl, JOHNHOLL at beerandbrewing.com, or on Twitter at John_Holl. And we will be back next week with a whole new episode. Thanks so much for listening. And Scott, thanks again.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
Cheers.
This episode has been brought to you by the American Homebrewers Association, the country's only not-for-profit membership organization dedicated to promoting the community of homebrewers and empowering homebrewers to make the best beer in the world. Brew with the AHA at homebrewersassociation.org, and remember, relax, don't worry, have a homebrew. This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew.